Chapter 5 Things Unseen. The book Miss Priest pulled from the bottom drawer of her desk felt as if it had been bound with real leather. The cover had no words on it, not even a title. Ignoring the crescendo of his stomach symphony, Jeremy opened it. The first page was as blank as the cover. On the second page, however, he found the title, On the Nature and Disappearance of Dragons. Jeremy turned the page again and nearly dropped the book. In addition to the title, this page added the name of the author, S.H. Elves. Jeremy's skin began to prickle. He looked at Miss Priest. "Where did you get this?" Hyacinth Priest shrugged. "Who knows where books come from? It's really a very great mystery, isn't it?" "Can I check it out?" Miss Priest nodded. "I've been saving it for you." The little hairs on the back of Jeremy's neck began to bristle. "How did you know I would be wanting it?" Miss Priest raised an eyebrow. "What are librarians for?" she asked. She reached forward and took Jeremy's wrist. Looking straight into his eyes, she said, "I would read that book very carefully if I were you, Jeremy Thatcher. Very carefully indeed." Jeremy spent most of the walk back to his house thinking alternately about his conversation with Miss Priest and about how incredibly hungry he was. He had almost made it through the park when a familiar voice called, "Jeremy! Hey, Jeremy!" He said a bad word. Mary Lou Hutton was the last thing he needed right now. "I should have known better than to walk home this way," he muttered. He considered running, but with the load he was carrying, he didn't have a chance of escaping. "How come you have so many books?" asked Mary Lou, falling into step beside him. "I didn't know you liked to read." Jeremy stopped and turned to her. "What do you think?" he asked angrily. "Only girls like to read? I read lots." "Like what?" Jeremy wanted to tell her to go away, but he knew she wouldn't, so there wasn't much point in that. Maybe if I keep her talking, she won't think about kissing me, he thought, with sudden hope. So he named some of his favorite books. To his surprise, Mary Lou had read most of them. They got to arguing about who was better, C.S. Lewis or Natalie Babbitt, and before he knew it, they were standing at the corner near his house. "Well, I gotta go," he said abruptly when he realized where they were. Mary Lou looked unhappy. Jeremy might actually have considered continuing the conversation, except his stomach began to roar with hunger again. "See you later," he called and ran for the house. When he got to the front door, he paused long enough to look around. "I hope nobody saw me talking to Mary Lou," he thought. Before he could worry much about that embarrassing possibility, he was distracted by a terrible sound from his bedroom. Bolting up the stairs, Jeremy threw open his door. "Hey!" he cried angrily. "Stop that!" The dragon, perched atop one of the gerbil cages, was hissing, shrieking, and flapping its tiny wings, as if it had wanted to lift the whole thing into the air. One terrified gerbil clung to the exercise wheel, shaking with fear. The other cowered in a corner, trying to hide under the sawdust. "Stop that!" repeated Jeremy, running toward the cage. "Stop it right now!" The dragon ignored him. Jeremy dropped his books and reached out to pull the dragon away from the cage. But between the creature's rapidly flapping wings and wide-open mouth, he couldn't figure out how to grab it. He kept reaching forward, then drawing his hands back. The dragon continued to strain at the cage. Finally, Jeremy closed his eyes and thought, as hard as he could, "Stop!" To his surprise, it worked. Somehow he knew, even though his eyes were still closed, that the dragon had turned toward him. Then it sent him a question. The question didn't come in the form of a word, of course. It came in that now familiar sense of questionness. Behind it were more questions, expressed half in feelings, half in fleeting images. He saw a picture of the dragon munching on a gerbil. With it came the sense that surely these rodents had no purpose other than to provide a dragon's dinner. The other thing that accompanied the images was a ravening hunger. Suddenly Jeremy understood that it hadn't been his own appetite that had roused him from his reading at the library. It had been the dragon's, which he was somehow sharing. The sensation returned so powerfully that he began wishing he could munch on a gerbil himself. "Blech," he said, opening his eyes. But his anger with the dragon dimmed when he remembered the pork chops he'd eaten for supper the night before. "When you get right down to it, I suppose there's not much difference between eating a pig and eating a guinea pig," he said, holding out his hand to the dragon. "And it's silly to be angry with you just for being hungry. No sense in getting mad at a cat for being a cat, as Dad would say. But I'm going to have to get you to understand that pets aren't snacks." The dragon was calmer now. It began crawling slowly up his arm. The feeling of the little claws against his skin made Jeremy twitch. About the time the dragon reached his elbow, Mrs. Thatcher stepped into the room. "What's going on in here?" she demanded. Terrified, Jeremy turned toward the door. He started to speak, then stopped. How could he possibly explain the dragon? "What was all that noise?" continued Mrs. Thatcher. "I could hear it all the way out in the yard." Jeremy blinked. Didn't she see the dragon? He flinched as one of its wingtips tickled his neck. "What are you twitching about?" asked Mrs. Thatcher. "Nothing," said Jeremy, feeling somewhat dazed. Mrs. Thatcher wrinkled her brow. "Well, what was all that noise up here a minute ago?" "Some of the animals were fighting," said Jeremy, pulling his head sideways as the dragon nipped affectionately at his ear. At least he hoped the gesture was affectionate. It was hard to tell with a beast that hungry. "I never heard any of them make a sound like that before. Maybe you'd better split them up." "I was just trying to figure out how to keep them apart when you came in," said Jeremy truthfully. As he spoke, the dragon started to crawl from one of his shoulders to the other. He tried not to laugh as the wings tickled his neck. "Well, let me know if you need another cage," said Mrs. Thatcher. "I think your dad has a few extras around his office. And stop wiggling, Jeremy. You look like you've got St. Vitus's dance." She started to leave, then turned back. "When you get things taken care of up here, I want you outside. Dad's got a full load of patients, and there's no reason I should have to do all the yard work myself." "Sure," said Jeremy, still trying to figure out why his mother wasn't saying anything about the dragon. Was it possible that she couldn't see it? The idea was strange, but no stranger than the dragon itself. His confusion was multiplied by the continuous waves of hunger coming from the dragon. He was having trouble concentrating until he heard his mother's next sentence. "By the way, your father's cooking up some business deal with the parents of one of the kids in your class. We're having the whole family over for dinner next week." "Who?" asked Jeremy, hoping it wasn't Howard or Freddie. "Their name is Hutton." Jeremy screamed and flung himself across the bed, causing the dragon to flutter into the air. "My life is over," moaned Jeremy. "How could you do this to me?" The dragon landed on the pillow. It stared at Jeremy, broadcasting crankiness about the sudden movement. Mrs. Thatcher seemed to feel the same way. "What on earth is the matter with you?" she demanded. "Are you really going to invite Mary Lou Hutton into this house?" "Any reason why we shouldn't?" "She's in love with me." Mrs. Thatcher smiled. "Well, I wouldn't take it too seriously, dear." "You don't understand, Mom. She wants to kiss me." "Oh, well, I wouldn't let her do that. You're a little young to start that kind of thing." "I don't want to let her do that. I want to stay as far away from her as I can." Mrs. Thatcher frowned. "I'm sure she'll behave herself during dinner, Jeremy. This is fairly important to your father, so I want you to be polite when they come." Jeremy sighed. He could tell there was no point in trying to explain the total humiliation he would suffer if Howard Morton and Freddie the Frog Killer found out that Mary Lou had been to his house for dinner. It would be bad enough if they found out she had walked him home, which they probably would, since she would probably tell everyone in school. Even Spess would have something to say about that. And it would give Howard, Freddie, and the others ammunition to make his life miserable for weeks. "Anyway, I want you to go outside soon," said his mother. "And for goodness sake, stop twitching. You look like you're having a nervous breakdown." He felt like he was having a nervous breakdown. He wanted to tell his mother that he would hold still if only the dragon would do the same. But there was no point in that. since then she would be sure he was crazy. So he just nodded and said, "I'll be down as soon as I can." Well aware of Jeremy's sense of time, Mrs. Thatcher snorted and left the room. As soon as she was gone, Jeremy plucked the dragon from his shoulders. "What is going on here?" he asked, looking straight into its emerald eyes.